9 Best Foods to Lower Cholesterol Naturally. Most people believe that cholesterol is something you simply inherit, something fixed, something you can do very little about. That belief is not accurate, and for millions of people it is quietly standing in the way of real progress. This video is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always speak with a qualified healthcare professional before making changes to your diet, especially if you are currently taking medication or managing a health condition. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. Cholesterol itself is not the villain most people assume it to be. Your body actually needs it to build cells, produce hormones, and support your nervous system. The real story is more nuanced, and it has everything to do with balance, with the kind of cholesterol circulating through your bloodstream and with the small, repeatable choices you make at the dinner table. Some of those choices are far more powerful than most people realize, and one food on this list in particular has been studied so extensively that researchers describe its effect as one of the most consistent nutritional findings of the last few decades. We will get to that one a little later, so stay with us. Before we go further, let us quickly clarify what we mean by cholesterol, since the word gets thrown around a lot without much explanation. Cholesterol travels through your blood attached to proteins, forming what are called lipoproteins. Low-density lipoprotein, often shortened to LDL, is sometimes referred to as the less favorable type because higher levels may be associated with plaque buildup in the arteries over time. High-density lipoprotein is often considered the more favorable type, since it may help carry excess cholesterol back to the liver for removal. The goal, broadly speaking, is to support healthier LDL levels while maintaining or improving HDL, and diet plays a meaningful role in that process, alongside physical activity, sleep, and overall lifestyle. There is also a common misconception worth addressing directly, since it tends to shape how people approach their own diets. Many people assume that avoiding cholesterol-containing foods entirely, such as eggs or shellfish, is the most important step they can take. Current research has largely shifted away from this idea. For most people, the saturated and trans fats found in processed and fried foods appear to have a far greater influence on blood cholesterol levels than dietary cholesterol itself does. This does not mean moderation no longer matters, but it does mean that the foods we are about to walk through, which focus on fiber, healthy fats, and specific plant compounds, tend to carry more weight in the research than simply avoiding a particular ingredient on a label. Now let us meet Robert. Robert is 61 years old, and for years he assumed that a cholesterol reading was simply a number handed down from his parents, something he had no real influence over. When his doctor mentioned that certain foods could meaningfully support his numbers over time, Robert was skeptical. He had tried cutting out butter here and there, but nothing seemed to move the needle. What changed for Robert was not a single dramatic decision. It was a series of small, consistent additions to his plate, several of which you are about to hear about. Robert's story is not unique, and it is not a promise of a particular outcome for everyone, but it is a helpful reminder that food choices, sustained over time, may genuinely matter. With that foundation in place, let us walk through 9 foods that research has repeatedly connected to healthier cholesterol levels, and let us talk honestly about why each one may help. Number 1. Oats and barley. There is a reason oatmeal shows up so often in conversations about heart health, and it comes down to a specific type of soluble fiber called beta-glucan. When you eat oats or barley, this fiber forms a gel-like substance in your digestive tract. That gel appears to bind with cholesterol-containing bile acids, which may prevent some of that cholesterol from being reabsorbed into your bloodstream, and instead encourages your body to use existing cholesterol to produce more bile acids, effectively lowering circulating levels. Multiple studies have observed that consistent intake of beta-glucan, in the range of roughly 3 grams per day, which is about the amount found in a bowl and a half of cooked oatmeal, may be associated with meaningful reductions in LDL cholesterol over a period of weeks. Barley works through a similar mechanism and can be added to soups, stews, or grain bowls for variety. What makes oats particularly approachable is how easily they fit into an everyday routine. A warm bowl in the morning, a spoonful of natural peanut butter, some sliced banana, perhaps a dusting of cinnamon, and you have a breakfast that is both satisfying and quietly working in your favor. It is worth noting that instant, heavily processed oat products with added sugar do not carry the same benefit profile, so choosing rolled or steel-cut oats tends to be the more supportive option. Number 2. Beans, peas, and lentils. Legumes rarely get the spotlight they deserve, yet the evidence behind them is remarkably consistent. Beans, peas, chickpeas, and lentils are rich in both soluble fiber and plant-based protein, and research suggests that regular consumption, even as little as around 3/4 of a cup daily, may be associated with modest but meaningful reductions in LDL cholesterol over a period of just a few weeks. Part of what makes legumes so effective is that they tend to displace less favorable options on the plate. When a serving of lentil soup replaces a serving of processed meat, the benefit is not only what you are adding, but also what you are leaving out. Legumes are also inexpensive, shelf-stable, and versatile, which makes them one of the more sustainable long-term additions to a heart-conscious diet. Consider Linda, a 70-year-old retired school teacher who began adding a half cup of black beans to her lunch salads several times a week, mostly because she enjoyed the texture. She was not chasing a specific health outcome. She simply liked the taste. Months later, during a routine checkup, her physician noted an improvement in her lipid panel and asked what had changed in her diet. Linda could not point to one dramatic shift, only a quiet, consistent habit that had become part of her week. Number 3. Fatty fish like salmon and mackerel. Fatty fish such as salmon, mackerel, sardines, and herring are rich sources of omega-3 fatty acids, a type of fat that behaves quite differently in the body compared to the saturated fats found in many processed foods. While omega-3 fatty acids are more closely associated with lowering triglycerides than with directly lowering LDL cholesterol, this distinction matters because triglycerides are another important marker of cardiovascular health, and elevated levels may be associated with increased risk. Some research also suggests that regular fatty fish consumption may modestly raise HDL cholesterol, the type often considered more favorable. Major health organizations have generally recommended aiming for 2 servings of fatty fish per week, prepared in ways that avoid heavy breading or deep frying, since the cooking method can significantly influence the overall nutritional impact. Grilling, baking, or gently pan-searing with olive oil tends to preserve the beneficial fat profile. For those who do not eat fish, algae-based omega-3 supplements are sometimes discussed as an alternative, though this is a conversation best had directly with a healthcare provider rather than something to self-prescribe. There is one more consideration worth mentioning, since it comes up often in questions from viewers. Some people worry about mercury content when it comes to fish consumption, and it is a fair concern. Generally speaking, smaller fish such as sardines, mackerel, and salmon tend to carry lower mercury levels compared to larger predatory fish like swordfish or certain types of tuna, since mercury tends to accumulate more heavily further up the food chain. Choosing smaller, oilier fish not only tends to align with lower mercury exposure, but also happens to align with higher omega-3 content, which works out conveniently for anyone specifically focused on cardiovascular health. Canned salmon and canned sardines, often overlooked in favor of fresh fillets, are perfectly reasonable options and tend to be considerably more affordable, which makes this a food group that does not require a large grocery budget to incorporate consistently. Number 4. Almonds and walnuts. Nuts have gone through something of a reputation shift over the past 2 decades. Once viewed primarily as a high-calorie snack to be limited, they are now recognized in much of the nutritional research as a food that may actively support cardiovascular health when eaten in moderation. Almonds and walnuts, in particular, have been studied extensively. Walnuts contain a notable amount of plant-based omega-3 fatty acids, while almonds are rich in monounsaturated fats and plant sterols, compounds that may interfere with the absorption of dietary cholesterol in the digestive tract. Research has generally pointed to a small handful, somewhere around 1 ounce or roughly a quarter cup, as a supportive daily amount, since larger quantities may contribute excess calories without additional benefit. The key appears to be consistency rather than quantity. Swapping an afternoon bag of chips for a small portion of raw or dry-roasted almonds is a simple substitution that, over months and years, may contribute to a more favorable lipid profile, particularly when it replaces a source of saturated fat or refined carbohydrates rather than simply being added on top of an already full diet. Frank, a 65-year-old retired mechanic, offers a good example of how this can play out in practice. He had spent years snacking on crackers and cheese in the evenings while watching television, a habit he genuinely enjoyed and was not particularly eager to give up. Rather than eliminating his evening snack altogether, he gradually replaced half of it with a small dish of mixed walnuts and almonds, keeping the rest of his routine largely the same. He described the change as barely noticeable in his daily life, yet at his next physical, his physician commented on a modest but favorable shift in his cholesterol panel. Frank's experience is a reminder that meaningful dietary change does not always require dramatic sacrifice. Sometimes it looks like a small, sustainable substitution repeated night after night. Number 5. Avocados. Avocados occupy an interesting place in this conversation because they manage to be both a source of healthy fat and a source of fiber at the same time. The majority of the fat in an avocado is monounsaturated, the same type of fat found in olive oil, and several studies have observed that replacing saturated fat sources with avocado, rather than simply adding avocado on top of an existing diet, may be associated with reductions in LDL cholesterol. One frequently cited study found that participants who ate one avocado daily as part of a moderate fat diet experienced a modest decrease in LDL levels compared to those who did not include avocado, though researchers were careful to note that the effect was tied to substitution rather than pure addition. This distinction matters quite a bit. Simply piling avocado onto an otherwise unchanged diet is unlikely to produce the same result as using it deliberately to replace butter, mayonnaise, or fatty cuts of meat in a given meal. Half an avocado mashed onto whole grain toast in place of butter, or sliced into a salad instead of cheese, are small, practical ways to apply this principle in daily life. Number 6. Extra virgin olive oil. If there is one food on this list that researchers return to again and again, it is extra virgin olive oil, and this is the item we mentioned earlier as being worth waiting for. Olive oil sits at the center of the Mediterranean dietary pattern, which has been studied more extensively than perhaps any other eating pattern in relation to heart health. Extra virgin olive oil is rich in monounsaturated fats and also contains polyphenols, plant compounds with antioxidant properties that some research suggests may help protect LDL particles from oxidation, a process that some scientists believe plays a role in artery-related changes over time. In large population studies, individuals who replaced butter, margarine, or other saturated fats with olive oil tended to show more favorable lipid profiles over the long term. The key word again is replacement. Using olive oil to cook vegetables instead of using butter, drizzling it over salads instead of creamy dressings, or dipping whole grain bread in olive oil instead of spreading butter on it are all practical applications of this same principle. It is worth noting that not all olive oil is created equal. Extra virgin varieties, which are less processed and retain more of their natural polyphenol content, are generally considered the more supportive choice compared to heavily refined light olive oils. A few practical notes tend to help people get more consistent benefit from olive oil in daily cooking. Storing it away from direct light and heat, ideally in a dark glass bottle in a cool cabinet rather than next to the stove, helps preserve its polyphenol content over time, since exposure to heat and light can gradually degrade these beneficial compounds. Olive oil is also fairly heat-stable for most everyday cooking methods such as sautéing, though very high-heat searing or deep frying is generally better suited to more heat-stable oils. For anyone new to cooking with olive oil regularly, starting with a moderate-quality extra virgin option for daily use, while reserving a more expensive, robust variety for finishing dishes or salads, tends to be a practical and budget-friendly approach. Number 7. Apples and berries. Apples, along with berries such as strawberries and blueberries, contain a soluble fiber called pectin, which works in a manner somewhat similar to the beta-glucan found in oats. Pectin may bind with cholesterol in the digestive system and help escort it out of the body before it has a chance to be absorbed into the bloodstream. Berries also bring an additional layer of benefit through their high concentration of antioxidants called anthocyanins, which give them their deep red, blue, and purple colors. Some research has suggested that regular berry consumption may be associated with modest improvements in HDL cholesterol, the more favorable type, alongside general cardiovascular benefits. What makes this category particularly approachable is how naturally it fits into daily life. An apple with the skin left on, since much of the pectin resides there, a handful of blueberries added to breakfast, or a bowl of mixed berries as an afternoon snack are all simple, low-effort additions. Consider Margaret, a 68-year-old grandmother who began keeping a bowl of apples on her kitchen counter instead of in the refrigerator, simply because she found herself reaching for them more often when they were in plain sight. It was a small environmental change, not a strict rule, and it gradually shifted her daily snacking habits in a more supportive direction. Frozen berries deserve a mention here as well, since fresh berries are not always available or affordable year-round, depending on where you live. Research generally indicates that frozen fruit retains most of its fiber and antioxidant content, since freezing tends to preserve nutrients fairly well compared to some other preservation methods. Tossing a handful of frozen blueberries into oatmeal, which conveniently pairs two of the foods on this list in a single bowl, is a simple way to combine benefits without much additional effort or cost. Number 8. Soy foods like tofu and edamame. Soy-based foods, including tofu, edamame, and soy milk, have been studied for decades in relation to cholesterol. And while the size of the effect observed in research has varied somewhat from study to study, the overall direction has generally pointed toward benefit, particularly when soy protein replaces animal protein in the diet rather than simply being added alongside it. Soy contains isoflavones, plant compounds that may have a mild influence on cholesterol metabolism, and soy protein itself appears to behave somewhat differently in the body compared to animal protein when it comes to lipid handling. A commonly referenced research consensus suggests that consuming around 25 grams of soy protein daily, roughly the amount found in 2 to 3 servings of tofu, edamame, or fortified soy milk, may be associated with a modest reduction in LDL cholesterol. For those unfamiliar with cooking with tofu, it is worth noting that firm or extra-firm varieties tend to hold up well in stir-fries, while softer varieties blend easily into smoothies or sauces, making it a fairly adaptable ingredient regardless of cooking experience. It is worth mentioning briefly how the research on soy has evolved, since some viewers may recall stronger claims from decades past. Earlier studies in the 1990s suggested a more dramatic cholesterol-lowering effect from soy protein than later. More rigorous research has confirmed. Current scientific consensus generally describes the effect as modest rather than dramatic, but still worth noting, particularly given that soy foods also tend to be low in saturated fat and free of cholesterol themselves, which means they often provide an indirect benefit simply by displacing less favorable protein sources such as fatty cuts of red meat or processed deli meats from the plate. Number 9's dark chocolate and cocoa. This last one tends to surprise people, and understandably so, since chocolate is not typically associated with heart-healthy eating. The key distinction lies in the cocoa content and the absence of excessive added sugar. Dark chocolate with a cocoa content of 70% or higher contains flavonols, plant compounds that some research has linked to modest improvements in blood vessel function, and in certain studies, small increases in HDL cholesterol. It is important to be clear-eyed here. Milk chocolate and heavily sweetened chocolate products generally do not carry the same benefit profile, and the quantities studied in research tend to be small, often just a square or two per day rather than an entire bar. Dark chocolate should be thought of as an occasional addition within an otherwise balanced diet rather than a primary strategy. But for those looking for a way to satisfy a sweet craving without working against their broader goals, a small piece of high cocoa dark chocolate paired with a handful of almonds or berries can be a thoughtful way to close out a meal. Taken together, these 9 foods share a few common threads worth pointing out before we wrap up. Many of them are rich in soluble fiber, which appears to interfere with cholesterol absorption in the gut. Several contain monounsaturated or omega-3 fats, which research generally associates with a more favorable lipid profile compared to saturated fats. And in nearly every case, the benefit observed in research was tied to these foods replacing less favorable options, rather than simply being piled on top of an unchanged diet. This distinction is easy to overlook, but it may be one of the more important takeaways from the research as a whole. Adding kale to a plate that still includes a large portion of processed meat is unlikely to produce the same result as using legumes, fish, or olive oil to replace some of that processed meat outright. It is also worth remembering that no single food acts in isolation. Cholesterol levels respond to a much broader picture that includes overall dietary pattern, physical activity, sleep quality, stress, and in some cases genetics and medication. The foods on this list are best understood as supportive tools within that larger picture, rather than standalone solutions. If you have concerns about your cholesterol levels, a conversation with your doctor or a registered dietitian remains the most reliable starting point, particularly if you are currently on cholesterol-lowering medication, since certain dietary changes may interact with how those medications work. It is also worth acknowledging that consistency tends to matter more than perfection. Very few people successfully overhaul every meal at once, and attempting to do so often leads to burnout rather than lasting change. A more realistic approach, and one that shows up repeatedly in long-term dietary research, involves choosing one or two changes at a time, allowing them to become comfortable habits, and then layering additional changes on top once the first ones feel natural. Someone might start by simply switching their cooking oil for a month, then add oatmeal to 2 or 3 mornings a week the following month, and gradually build outward from there. This slower approach tends to be far more sustainable than attempting to adopt all 9 foods simultaneously. And sustainability, more than any single food on this list, is ultimately what determines whether dietary changes translate into long-term results. Let us bring this back to where we started. Robert, the 61-year-old we mentioned earlier, did not overhaul his entire life overnight. He added oatmeal to his mornings, swapped butter for olive oil most nights, started keeping a bag of almonds at his desk instead of chips, and began having salmon once or twice a week instead of red meat most nights. Nothing about it felt extreme. Several months later, his numbers had shifted in a direction his doctor described as encouraging. His experience is not a guarantee for everyone, since individual results vary considerably, but it is a useful illustration of how consistent, moderate changes applied over time may be more powerful than most people initially assume. If there is one statistic worth carrying with you from this video, it is this. Research on soluble fiber consistently points to reductions in LDL cholesterol in the range of 5 to 10% when intake reaches recommended levels through foods like oats, barley, legumes, and fruit. And when combined with other supportive dietary patterns, the cumulative effect over months and years can be considerably more meaningful than that single number suggests on its own. So here is a question worth sitting with. Of the 9 foods we covered today, which one do you think would be easiest to start adding to your week, and which one might take a bit more effort to work in? We would genuinely like to know, so drop a comment below and let us know where you are starting from. If this video gave you something useful to think about, sharing it with someone who might benefit is one of the simplest ways to help it reach them. And if you would like more videos like this one, subscribing helps make sure you do not miss what is coming next. Thank you for spending this time with us and take care of yourself.